I never imagined that my marriage could be dismantled by someone who wasn't even living under our roof. When I married my wife, Sarah, 6 years ago, we were a team. We were two people against the world, building our life from the ground up, brick by brick. We bought our first home in a quiet neighborhood, and for the first 3 years, it was our sanctuary, a place of laughter, late-night conversations, and genuine partnership. But then the shadow moved in. Her mother, Margaret, didn't technically move into our guest room, but she colonized our lives nonetheless. It started with helpful visits. Margaret would drop by on Saturday mornings without calling, claiming she was just in the neighborhood to bring over groceries. Within minutes, she would be rearranging our pantry, commenting on the way I loaded the dishwasher, or sighing loudly at the decor choices Sarah and I had agonized over together. I tried to stay patient, telling myself it was just a mother's way of showing she cared. But the frequency of these intrusions began to gnaw at the foundation of our happiness. The real shift was subtle, the way erosion is slow, steady, and devastating. Sarah started citing her mother's opinions as if they were divine commandments. Whenever I proposed a weekend getaway, a budget change, or even a different brand of coffee, Sarah would hesitate, her eyes flickering with a sudden, anxious doubt. "Well," she would say, her voice losing its confidence, "Mom mentioned the other day that we should be more careful with our savings." Or, "Mom thinks that area is too noisy for us." I felt like I was losing my wife to a phantom presence. Every decision we made was filtered through the lens of what Margaret might say or think. It was as if I were living with two women, the Sarah I adored, and the puppet version of her that danced to the strings of a woman who seemed determined to keep our marriage in a state of perpetual adolescence. One evening, I came home from work expecting a quiet dinner, only to find the dining table covered in legal brochures and property listings for apartments 3 blocks away from Margaret's house. Sarah was sitting there, her face drawn, looking like a teenager caught doing something she shouldn't. Margaret was hovering over her, pointing at a map with a sharp, crimson-nailed finger. "Oh, look who's finally home," Margaret said, not bothering to look up from the table. "Sarah and I were just discussing how much better it would be for the kids, whenever you two decide to have them, if you were closer to family. It's far too expensive for you to keep maintaining this large house, and I think it's time we made some sensible adjustments." I stood in the doorway, my coat still on, feeling a cold, hard knot of resentment settle in my chest. I looked at Sarah, hoping for a sign of resistance, a flash of the woman who used to stand up for us. But she just avoided my gaze, rubbing her temples as if the weight of her mother's expectations were physically crushing her. "We aren't moving, Margaret," I said, my voice quiet but firm. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken tensions. Margaret finally looked up, her expression a mask of practiced, condescending pity. "It's not about what you want, dear. It's about what's best for the family. And frankly, Sarah has been very clear about how overwhelmed she feels with your lack of direction." That was the moment the scale tipped. I realized that my wife hadn't just been listening to her mother. She had been confiding in her, painting me as the villain in her own house to justify her own inability to set boundaries. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them to their maps and their schemes. That night, as I lay in the darkness of the guest bedroom, I realized that I wasn't fighting for a house or a budget. I was fighting for the soul of my marriage, and I was losing. The following week was a suffocating blur of passive-aggressive comments and hushed conversations that stopped the moment I entered a room. Sarah had retreated into a shell, her eyes constantly darting toward her phone whenever it pinged with a notification from her mother. I tried to reach her, to pull her back to the partnership we once had, but every attempt was met with the same rehearsed, hollow excuses. She wasn't just struggling with her mother's influence. She was actively gaslighting me, pretending that nothing was wrong while our life was being dismantled piece by piece. The boiling point came on a Tuesday evening. I came home early from work to find the locks on our front door had been changed. I stood on my own porch, keys useless in my hand, staring at the cold, metal deadbolt. I had to knock, and when Sarah finally opened the door, she looked terrified. Behind her, Margaret was standing in the middle of our living room, calmly folding laundry as if she owned the place. "We thought it was time for an upgrade. For security," Sarah said, her voice brittle and lacking conviction. "Mom said the old ones were outdated." I pushed past them, the anger that had been simmering for months finally threatening to boil over. "Security from what, Sarah? Security from your husband in his own home? We are not living in a prison, and I am not a guest here." Margaret didn't even look up from the laundry. "Don't be so dramatic, dear. Sarah is just protecting herself. A woman needs to be careful when her husband is as unstable as you've been lately." "Unstable?" I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed off the walls. "I'm the only one here who isn't living in a fantasy world constructed by your mother. Sarah, look at this. Look at your house. Since when did you become a side character in your own life?" Sarah started to cry, covering her face with her hands, but she didn't move toward me. She turned toward her mother, seeking comfort, and Margaret immediately wrapped an arm around her, shooting me a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. That was the moment the last shred of my hope evaporated. I realized then that I wasn't fighting for Sarah anymore. I was fighting for my own dignity. I didn't yell anymore. I didn't beg. I walked into the bedroom, pulled a suitcase from the top shelf, and began filling it with my clothes. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of drawers sliding shut. When I walked back out to the living room, suitcase in hand, Sarah finally looked up, her expression shifting from fear to a stunned, hollow disbelief. "Where are you going?" she whispered. "I'm going to stay at a hotel," I said, my voice cold and steady. "I'm not living in a house where my own wife and mother-in-law treat me like an intruder. When you're ready to be an adult and a partner, call me. Until then, don't bother." I walked out the door and didn't look back. As I drove away into the night, the weight that had been crushing my chest for weeks finally began to lift. I was alone, I was hurt, and I was furious, but for the first time in a very long time, I felt like a man again. I had taken the first step toward saving myself, even if it meant losing everything else. The days that followed were a cold, jarring reality check for Sarah. I didn't reach out, and I didn't respond to the dozens of frantic texts or missed calls that lit up my phone screen. I needed the distance to heal, but more importantly, I needed to see if she was capable of choosing our life over her mother's control without me there to serve as the constant punching bag. I spent my time in a small, rented apartment, finally reclaiming the parts of myself I had buried to keep the peace. I focused on my work and my own mental health, treating the separation not as the end, but as a necessary surgical procedure to remove the toxic influence that had been rotting our relationship from the inside. Meanwhile, the dynamic in our home, or rather what had been our home, had shifted into something catastrophic for them. Without me there to blame or to act as a buffer, the full weight of Margaret's manipulative nature landed squarely on Sarah. I learned through a mutual friend that Margaret had moved from helpful to openly tyrannical, micromanaging Sarah's diet, her work schedule, and her social life, all while constantly berating her for losing her husband due to her own incompetence. The illusion finally shattered on a rainy Thursday afternoon. My phone rang, and it wasn't the usual panicked, accusatory tone I had grown accustomed to. It was a voice thick with exhaustion and genuine heartbreak. "I can't do this anymore," Sarah whispered, the sound of her crying muffled by the line. "She's not helping me, Mark. She's just tearing everything apart. I lost the only person who actually cared about me because I was too blind to see what she was doing. I'm sitting in an empty house, and I finally realized that it's empty because of us, because of what I let her do. She didn't ask me to come back. She simply confessed to the wreckage. She told me that she had finally stood up to Margaret, ordered her to leave, and that she was currently packing up all of her mother's belongings that had been slowly filling our home. Hearing her take that first, difficult step didn't magically fix everything, but for the first time in years, it felt like I was talking to the woman I had married, not a marionette. I told her I would meet her for coffee the next day, but that it wasn't a guarantee of reconciliation. It was a conversation about the truth. When we met, she looked thinner, tired, and unadorned, stripped of the influence that had been poisoning her perspective. She didn't make excuses. She just sat there and laid bare every manipulation and every moment of weakness. She finally understood that a marriage is a closed system between two people, and that once you let a third person sit at the table, you're no longer a couple, you're just an audience. The coffee shop was quiet, the only sound the hum of the espresso machine, a stark contrast to the chaotic noise that had defined our last few months together. Sarah didn't reach for my hand, and she didn't offer any desperate promises. She simply looked at me, her eyes clear for the first time in years, and handed me a set of keys. "I changed the locks back," she said, her voice steady. "And Margaret hasn't been to the house in 3 days. I told her that if she ever tries to cross the threshold again, I'll call the police." I had to choose Mark. I finally realized that if I didn't lose her, I was going to lose the only life I actually wanted to live. It was the first time she had taken full responsibility without shifting the blame or centering her mother's feelings. I looked at the keys, then back at her, feeling a strange, cautious hope blooming in the silence. I knew that one conversation couldn't undo the damage of years of manipulation, and I was wary of how quickly things could slide back into old patterns. "I need to know this is real, Sarah," I said, leaning forward. "I can't go back to being the invisible husband in my own home. I need boundaries, and I need to know that we are the priority, not whatever your mother demands." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I know. I've spent so much time being someone's daughter that I forgot how to be your wife. I'm ready to do the work, in therapy, at home, and in every decision we make from here on out." We didn't go back to the house that day. Instead, we spent the next month in a slow, deliberate process of dating each other again, rebuilding the trust from scratch. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of lingering resentment and old habits that flared up, but each time, we addressed them directly rather than letting Margaret's shadow dictate the outcome. We set rigid boundaries. No unannounced visits, no shared financial access for family, and a strict rule that our private marital business stayed private. When Margaret tried to call and guilt-trip Sarah about abandoning her, Sarah calmly explained that our marriage was not up for negotiation and hung up the phone, without checking with me or apologizing to her mother. That was the moment I knew the change was permanent. Looking back, the destruction of our life as I knew it was the only way to save it. I often wonder if other couples facing this kind of toxic interference ever find their way back, or if the weight of the past is simply too heavy to carry. We managed to rebuild, but it taught me a hard lesson. A marriage isn't just about love. It's about having the courage to protect the space you share from anyone, even family, who tries to poison it. We saved us, but I'll never forget the cost of that war. It was worth it to finally have my wife back, but it makes me wonder, how many other men are out there right now, silently watching their own marriages being dismantled by someone they never thought they'd have to fight?